Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet and today we'll be looking at the Markov Noble, Timothar, Baron of Bats. Before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description to keep me caffeinated as I work on more of these builds. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see who won last week's poll and what commanders from Crimson Vow you'll be voting for an upcoming episode. So with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Timothar, Baron of Bats is a 4/4 Vampire Noble with Ward, discard a card that costs 4 and double black with the following ability. Whenever another non-token vampire you control dies, you may pay 1 and exile it. If you do, create a 1/1 black bat flying creature token with flying. It gains, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, sacrifice it and return the exiled card to the battlefield tapped. As we can see, this Scion of House Markov is packing a huge CMC, a somewhat unremarkable stat line but a quite annoying ward as protection, and an ability that makes sure that vampires under his command don't stay dead for long. At a glance, his ability allows us to effectively save any vampire we control that would otherwise be destroyed by exiling it and turning it into a 1/1 flying bat token, which we can then use to bring back the original vampire by having it deal combat damage. And while this serves as a pretty decent protection effect on its own right to keep our vampires around longer as they get destroyed, it also enables us to potentially get additional ETB triggers and death triggers from those vampires. As since this is not a replacement effect, the vampire still goes to the grave before being exiled, allowing us to get some serious value out of our vampires as our opponents destroy them or we sack them away for value. So, as befitting of a power-hungry vampire scion of House Markov, this build will be featuring Timothar leading a host of mono-black vampires into the fray, and cannibalizing them for power again and again as he keeps restoring them with his ability for maximum value. That means we'll be running a substantial number of vampires with ETB and Death Triggers, as well as both vampiric and non-vampiric means to sack them, ensuring that we have no shortage of triggers for Timothar to reuse again and again, and plenty of ways to get our vamps into the bin for him to do so. And since we're in black, we'll be taking advantage of all the tutoring effects this color has to offer, ensuring that we don't have to blindly top deck and hope to draw into our key cards, but instead precisely search up whatever we may need at any given time, substantially improving our deck's consistency. And lastly, as Timothar is unable to protect himself with his own ability, we'll have to use other means to keep him alive through our opponent's attempts to remove him, both through generic means such as granting him hexproof and indestructible, to more game plan focused means that allow him to consume his broodmates in order to regenerate himself, ensuring that he'll be sticking around for the long haul and keep his brood coming back again and again. So, with his army of expendable vampire cronies at his beck and call, Timothar's eager to take the fight to our opponents. Hell hath no fury like a vampire scorned after all, and this vampire has plenty of fury to spare since Olivia left him for his progenitor. It was either this or therapy, and at least this way he gets a free meal out of it. So now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Starting in the CMC1 slot, we have its trio of entrants with Indulgent Aristocrat, Shadow Alley Denizen, and Viscera Seer. Indulgent Aristocrat is a 1/1 with lifelink that lets us pay 2 and sack a creature to put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire we control, serving as a cheap sack outlet that pumps Timothar and our other vampires including itself while also enabling Timothar to recur the sacked creatures. Shadow Alley Denizen is another 1/1 that, whenever a black creature ETBs under our control, lets us give target creature we control Intimidate until the end of the turn, proccing both as we summon our creatures and create bat tokens with our commander to reliably allow our bigger vampires to get in for damage. Viscera Seer is yet another 1/1, this one letting us sack a creature to scry 1, making it a free sack outlet to proc our commander and other payoffs at will while giving us some decent card selection in the process. Moving on to the CMC2 slot, we have some Death Trigger vampires joining our ranks with Blood Artist, Carrier Thrall, and Cordial Vampire. Blood Artist is a 0/1 that, whenever it or another creature dies, has target opponent lose 1 life while we gain 1 life, giving us a very cheap death payoff that generates a huge amount of drain as both our opponents and our creatures die off. Carrier Thrall is a 2/1 that, when it dies, creates a 1/1 Eldrazi Scion token that we can sack to generate a colorless mana, producing an extra body when it dies by either us or our opponent's hand and generating a sum ramp with a token it produces, which we can store up nicely as we sack them over and over again. Cordial Vampire is a 1/1 that, whenever it or another creature dies, puts a +1/+1 counter on each vampire we control. Like Indulgent Aristocrat before it, allowing us to grow our brood with counters, though at a much quicker rate as both our and our opponent's creatures die off. The latter half of this slot then brings us Dusk Legion Zealot, Malakir Bloodpriest, and Vermin Gorger. Dusk Legion Zealot is a 1/1 that, when it ETBs, has us draw a card and lose a life, serving as a low-cost source of card draw initially that we can recur again and again with our commander to turn into a repeatable source of card advantage. Malakir Bloodpriest is a 2/1 that, when it ETBs, has each opponent lose X life while we gain X life, X being equal to the number of creatures in our party. On its own, serving as an okay source of repeatable AoE drain, but being even better as we assemble our non-zero number of party-focused vampires for an even bigger and bigger drain effect every time we recur it. Vermin Gorger is a 2/2 that we can tap and sack another creature to have each opponent lose 2 life while we gain 2 life, giving us a free sack outlet once per turn that continues on the drain plan by piling on the life loss to our opponents while padding our own life totals. Entering the CMC3 slot now, we start off with some ETB-focused vampires with Arrogant Outlaw, Vampire Spawn, and Callous Blood Mage. Arrogant Outlaw is a 3/2 that, when it ETBs, has all our opponents lose 2 life while we gain 2 life if an opponent lost life that turn. Its conditional drain effect being easily met by the large number of drain effects we're running, as well as the bat token that resummons it when it cracks in for damage, making it an easily recurable source of drain. Vampire Spawn is a 2/3 that, when it ETBs, has each opponent lose 2 life while we gain 2 life, making it a non-conditional version of Arrogant Outlaw to further steal life from our opponents again and again. Callous Blood Mage is a 2/1 that, when it ETBs, has to choose one of the following effects: create a 1/1 pest token that gains us 1 life when it dies, draw a card and lose a life, or exile target player's graveyard, providing us with a decent suite of abilities to choose from every time we play or recur it, making it a very flexible card to get us more bodies on board, generate card advantage, or serve as graveyard hate depending on what we need. Then we have the last 3 vampire entrants in this lot with Bloodflow Connoisseur, Pawn of Ulamog, and Nocturnal Feeder. Bloodflow Connoisseur is a 1/1 that lets us sack a creature to put a +1/+1 counter on it, serving as another free sack outlet that can become a pretty big threat over time to swing in with. Pawn of Ulamog is a 2/2 that, whenever it or another non-token creature we control dies, creates a 0/1 Eldrazi spawn token that can sack itself to produce a colorless mana, making it the upgraded version of Carrier Thrall that produces substantially more tokens as we sack our creatures, which we can then use as ramp to fuel our higher CMC spells. Nocturnal Feeder is a 2/1 flyer that, when it dies, has each opponent lose 2 life while we gain 2 life, serving as the inverse of Vampire Spawn that drains upon death instead of ETB, still contributing to the drain plan but also allowing us to swing in safely with it thanks to its evasion. Then closing out this lot we have 2 non-vampires, those being Ayara First of Lochthwain and Burnished Heart. Ayara First of Lochthwain is a 2/3 that, whenever she or another black creature ETBs under our control, has each opponent lose 1 life while we gain 1 life, and who we can tap and sack another black creature to draw a card. Providing us both a sack outlet to generate card advantage and a continual source of drain is our creatures ETB, including our bat tokens and our creatures again whenever they're recurred, for a substantial amount of drain over the course of the game. Burnished Heart is a 2/2 that we can pay 3 and sack to put 2 basic lands from our deck into play tapped, serving as a good source of land-based ramp to keep our mana base growing nicely. Reaching the CMC4 slot, we have some additional Death Trigger vamps with Blood Tracker, Falcon Wrath Noble, and Vindictive Vampire. Blood Tracker is a 2/2 flyer that lets us pay a black and 2 life to put a +1/+1 counter on it, drawing us a card for each counter on it when it leaves the field, enabling us to weaponize our life gain effects by powering its evasive body up to safely swing in with and converting it into draw when we or our opponents remove it. Falcon Wrath Noble is another 2/2 flyer that, whenever it or another creature dies, has target opponent lose 1 life while we gain 1 life, essentially making it the scaled up version of Blood Artist that still puts out the consistent drain we want while also being evasive to get in for damage while dodging blockers. Vindictive Vampire is a 2/3 that, whenever another creature we control dies, has each opponent lose 1 life while we gain 1 life, giving us another AoE drain effect as we sack our vampires away and as our bats sack themselves away to return said vampires into play to drain out our opponents even faster. Then we close out this slot with a pair of double black pip vampires, those being Henrika Damanathi and Sanctum Seeker. Henrika Damanathi is a 1/3 flyer that, at the start of our combat phase, has us choose one of the following abilities that has not been previously chosen. Each player sacks a creature, draw a card and lose a life, or transform her into Henrika Infernal Seer. A 3/4 flyer with Death Touch and Lifelink that lets us pay 1 and double black to give all our creatures with Flying, Death Touch, and or Lifelink +1/+0 until end of turn. Her front face serving as a decent source of repeatable AoE edict removal and draw as we recur her, while her back face makes for a well-statted evasive body that can power up our bats and flying vampires to get some additional damage in as they swing in to help finish off our opponents faster. Sanctum Seeker is a 3/4 that, whenever a vampire we control attacks, has each opponent lose 1 life while we gain 1 life, working nicely alongside our other vampires as they swing in for an ever-growing AoE source of drain. Entering the CMC5 slot, we start off with some life loss sources with Bishop of the Bloodstained and Malakir Blood Witch. Bishop of the Bloodstained is a 3/3 that, when it ETBs, has target opponent lose 1 life for each vampire we control, enabling us to deal substantial chunks of damage to our opponents thanks to the resilience Timothar provides our vampires, while also being recurable itself to be used over and over again. Malakir Blood Witch is a 4/4 flyer with protection from white that, when it ETBs, has each opponent lose life equal to the amount of vampires we control, while we gain life equal to the amount of life lost this way. Again, serving as another recurable vampire payoff, this time dealing big AoE damage and healing us for an absurd amount to help stabilize our life totals in the later game if needed. Another pair of vampire payoffs then close out this lot with Anawan the Ruin Sage and Champion of Dusk. Anawan the Ruin Sage is a 4/3 that, on our upkeep, has each player sack a non-vampire creature, serving as a disruptive source of AoE edict removal that hardly affects us, and is difficult to remove permanently thanks to our commander. Champion of Dusk is a 4/4 that, when it ETBs, has us draw X cards and lose X life, where X is the number of vampires we control, allowing us to refill our hands quickly and repeatedly as we recur them onto established board states, the life loss being negligible considering the amount of life drain effects we're running. Nearly at the end now, the CMC 6 slot brings us its trio of entrants with Crossway Troublemakers, Nirkana Revenant, and Patron of the Vein. Crossway Troublemakers is a 5/5 that gives all attacking vampires we control lifelink and death touch, and whenever a vampire we control dies, lets us pay 2 life to draw a card, giving us a pretty beefy stat block that also makes all our vampires very effective on offense, and even giving us additional tribal card advantage as they die off. Nirkana Revenant is a 4/4 that has each swamp we control produce an extra black mana when tapped, and lets us pay a black to give it +1/+1 until end of turn, providing us with an enormous amount of ramp as soon as it hits the board, and even serving as its own mana sink to pump itself massively at instant speed for an insane amount of potential damage our opponents can't ignore. Patron of the Vein is another 4/4, this time with flying, that destroys a creature an opponent controls when it ETBs, and, when an opponent's creature dies, exiles it and puts a +1/+1 counter on each vampire we control, serving as additional removal, graveyard hate, and vampire pumping all at once, all on a decently statted evasive body to boot. Finally, reaching the CMC 7 slot, we come to our last creature with Butcher of Malakir, a 5/4 flyer that, whenever it or another creature we control dies, has each opponent sack a creature, weaponizing our self-sacking playstyle by tacking on AoE edict removal every time we sack a creature, being absolutely devastating to our opponent's board state so long as it sticks around. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instance. Starting in the CMC 1 slot, we have its pair of entrants with Defile and Village Rites. Defile has target creature lose -1/-1 until end of turn for each swamp we control, giving us a very cheap and effective source of non-destruction removal for our mono-colored build. Village Rites has us sack a creature to draw 2 cards, both providing us a way to sack our vampires to proc Timothar and letting us dig deeper into our deck for more resources while we do so. Moving on to the CMC 2 slot, we have our last trio of instants with Cast Down, Go for the Throat, and Heartless Act, all of which destroy target creature, the first being limited to non-legendaries, the second to non-artifacts, and the last to creatures with no counters on them, or instead removing up to 3 counters from them, all of which are cheap and efficient sources of removal that, despite their limitations, still work well to deal with a wide variety of creature-based threats at instant speed. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. Starting in the CMC 0 slot, we have Profane Tutor, which we must cast for its suspend cost of 1 and a black, and searches our deck for any card, putting it into our hand, giving us a cheap if slow means to search up any sack outlets, specific creatures, or anything else we may need to add extra consistency to our build. Skipping to the CMC 2 slot, we have its pair of entrants joining us with Feed the Swarm and Sign in Blood. Feed the Swarm destroys target creature or enchantment an opponent controls, then has us lose life equal to its CMC. Being one of the few ways that black is able to deal with enchantments, and while its life loss can be annoying, we have plenty of life drain effects to help lessen the blow. Sign in Blood has target player draw 2 cards and lose 2 life, serving as a cheap form of card draw for us that can double up as a shock when needed for that extra bit of damage to finish off an opponent. Entering the CMC 3 slot, we have its single entry with Read the Bones, which lets us scry 2, draw 2, and lose 2 life, making it a solid source of card selection and card advantage whose life loss again is mitigated by the amount of drain effects we're running in this build that helps us keep our hands nice and full. Now reaching the CMC 4 slot, we start off with Diabolic Tutor and Mastermind's Acquisition, both of which allow us to search our deck for any card and put it into our hand, each providing us with a powerful tutor effect at a reasonable cost to greatly increase this deck's consistency, enabling us to cherry-pick the cards we may need at any given time instead of hoping to draw into them. Then we close out this slot with Crippling Fear, which has us select a creature type, then has each creature outside of that creature type lose -3/-3 until end of turn, serving as a decent tribal wipe that helps clear the board of smaller creatures while leaving our vampires untouched. Moving on to the CMC 5 slot, we have Increasing Ambition and Dark Petition, another pair of tutors that search our deck for any card and put it into our hand, the former having Flashback for 7 and a black and tutoring 2 cards instead of 1 when flashed back, and the latter having Spell Mastery, generating triple black mana if we have at least 2 instants and or sorceries in our grave when we cast it, adding even more consistency to our build, with these having some upside to make up for their higher casting costs. Then we close out this slot with Olivia's Wrath, which has non-vampires lose -X/-X until end of turn equal to the number of vampires we control, serving as the upgraded version of Crippling Fear that both scales as we play our vampires and dodges them completely from its effect, making it a near-perfect tribal wipe for our build. Finally, reaching the CMC 6 slot, we have our last sorcery with Beseech the Queen, which costs 3 variable 2 generic or black mana and lets us search our deck for a card with CMC less than or equal to the amount of lands we control, easily being castable for 3 black mana in this build and giving us a very cheap tutor effect that can still search up some potent cards even with only 3 lands in play. That covers all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. Starting off in the CMC 1 slot, we have Vampiric Rites, which lets us pay 1, a black, and sack a creature to gain a life and draw a card, making it a sack outlet that hits the board early and helps us get card advantage and life gain at a reasonable cost, multiple times per turn if necessary. Moving on to the CMC 2 slot, we have another single entry with Dark Privilege, an aura that gives the enchanted creature +1/+1 and lets us regenerate it by sacrificing a creature, serving as a low-cost way to keep Timothar alive and allowing us to enable his recursion in the process, alongside a small stat boost for good measure. Entering the CMC 3 slot, we start off with more protection sources with Blessing of Leeches and Soul Channeling, both of which are auras that give the enchanted creature the ability to regenerate itself, the former being castable at flash speed and costing 0 to do this, though it does cost us 1 life on each of our upkeeps, and the latter costing 2 life to regenerate the creature instead, enabling us to turn our life drain into protection for our commander and ensuring he's able to live through most conventional forms of destruction-based removal multiple times per turn if necessary. Then we end the slot with Bastion of Remembrance, which creates a 1/1 human token when it ETBs, and, whenever a creature we control dies, has each opponent lose 1 life while we gain 1 life. Adding yet another source of AoE drain, this one from the back row, which is a bit harder for our opponents to interact with. Reaching the CMC 4 slot, we have a single entry joining us with Consecrated by Blood, an aura that gives the enchanted creature +2/+2 in flying, as well as letting us regenerate it by sacking 2 creatures, turning our commander into a sizable evasive threat, while again providing protection and a free sack outlet to enable our vampire recurring playstyle. Finally, reaching the CMC 5 slot, we have our last enchantment with Gift of Doom, an aura that gives the enchanted creature Death Touch and Indestructible, as well as having a morph cost of sacking a creature, attaching itself to a creature when it's turned face up, which will always be playing for its morph cost to give us an instant speed way to make our commander incredibly difficult to deal with for no mana cost, as well as triggering his ability when it does so for good measure. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. Starting off in the CMC 1 slot, we have Soul Ring and Wayfarer's Bauble, both of which serve as excellent sources of ramp, the former by tapping for 2 colorless, and the latter by letting us pay 2, tapping it and sacking it to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, helping us immensely in the early game to get a substantial lead over our opponent's mana base, especially since we're a mono-colored deck. Some more rocks then join us in the CMC 2 slot, starting with Arcane Signet, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Mind Stone, which taps for colorless and we can pay 1, tap it and sack it to draw a card, Charcoal Diamond, which comes into play tapped and taps for a black, and Ebony Fly, which comes into play tapped, taps for a colorless, and lets us pay 4 to roll a d6, turning it into an XX flying creature equal to the result until the end of the turn that grants another creature flying when it attacks, all helping us speed up our mana curve to reach our commander, and some of which grant us extra utility when we no longer need the mana. Then closing out this slot, we have Pyre of Heroes and Swiftfoot Boots. Pyre of Heroes at sorcery speed lets us pay 2, tap it and sack a creature to search our deck for a creature of the same type with CMC 1 higher than the sacked creature, and put it into play, making it a superb sack outlet and tutoring/cheating into play effect that works well with our commander to lose us nothing as we sack our creatures to grow our board state, making it a prime target for our tutor effects to get it on board as quickly as possible. Swiftfoot Boots is an equipment that equips for 1 and grants the equipped creature hexproof and haste, serving as another way to keep Timothar alive through our opponent's attempts to remove him and enabling him and our bigger vampires to swing into combat immediately. Finally, reaching the CMC 3 slot, we have our last 2 artifacts, starting with Worn Power Stone, which comes into play tapped and taps for 2 colorless, providing us a substantial boost to our mana base for a relatively low cost, and Crowded Crypt, which taps for a black and gains a corpse counter whenever a creature we control dies, letting us pay 4 double black, tapping it and sacking it to create 2/2 zombie tokens with Decayed for each corpse counter on it, both ramping us and serving as a ticking time bomb as we sack and recur our vampires to enable us to flood the board with zombies once we don't need the mana anymore. That covers all our artifacts, and since we have no planeswalkers in this build, let's move straight to our land base. Starting with our mana lands, we have 2 entrants with Path of Ancestry, which comes into play tapped, taps for any color in our commander's color identity, and scries 1 if the mana it produces is used to pay for a creature of a type matching our commander for some decent card selection over the course of the game as we cast our vampires, and Myriad Landscape, which comes into play tapped, taps for a colorless, and lets us pay 2, tap it and sack it to put 2 basic lands of the same type from our deck into play tapped, giving us some decent land-based ramp from our land slot. Moving on to our utility lands, we start off with Bojuga Bog, Ghost Quarter, and High Market. Bojuga Bog comes into play tapped, taps for a black, and exiles target opponent's graveyard when it ETBs, serving as a nice source of graveyard hate in the land slot to deal with graveyard-focused builds. Ghost Quarter taps for a colorless and we can tap it and sack it to destroy target land, having its owner replace it with a basic from their deck, giving us a good way to snipe out any problematic utility lands our opponents may be running. High Market also taps for a colorless and we can tap it and sack a creature to gain a life, serving as a free and repeatable sack outlet from our land slot to help enable our commander. Then we close out our utility lands with Hostile, which taps for a colorless and we can pay 1, tap it and sack a creature at sorcery speed to put a soul counter on it, transforming it into creeping in once it acquires 3. A 3/7 that, whenever it attacks, has us exile a creature from our grave to have each opponent lose X life while we gain X life, X being equal to the amount of cards exiled this way, as well as letting us phase it out for 4. Initially providing us with another sack outlet from the land slot that eventually turns into a big defensive stat block that piles on even more drain effects by using up any vampires we were unable to save with our commander. Finally, we're running 30 swamps as our basics to close out our land base. So now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 31 creatures including the commander, 5 instants, 11 sorceries, 7 enchantments, 10 artifacts, 0 planeswalkers, and 36 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 29 vampires, 10 cards that care about vampires, 11 ETB triggers, 13 death triggers, 13 sack outlets and effects, 6 sources of protection, and 7 tutor effects, leaving us with enough vampires and vampire payoffs to make the most of our commander's ability to return them to the field, most of which have effects that proc as they or others enter and leave the battlefield, plenty of ways to keep our commander alive, as well as a handful of ways to search up any of the aforementioned cards whenever we may need them. For general deck stats, we have 12 ramp sources, 11 card draw sources, 10 targeted removal sources, and 2 board wipes, which is where we want to see all our core stats in a typical build with no real outliers. Looking at our mana curve, we have 1 0-drop, 8 1-drops, 18 2-drops, 14 3-drops, 9 4-drops, 8 5-drops, 5 6-drops, and 1 7-drop, giving us a mid-weight curve that aims to ramp hard in the early game to get our commander on board quickly, then use our creatures and sack outlets to begin draining all our opponents simultaneously by the mid-game. Currently, this deck is valued at $64.86, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For side grades, some other vampires could certainly find a home in this build. Vampire Hexmage, for example, makes for a cheap and effective way to deal with planeswalkers and other counter-focused builds, while Legion Vanguard gives us another sack outlet and potential card advantage every time it explores. Vampire Sovereign would be a fine include if we want a single target drain effect on a decently sized evasive body, and Voldaren Pariah makes for a potent sack effect and edict removal tool to disrupt our opponent's board states. For upgrades, Vampire Nocturnus would be a fine include to give our deck a fairly consistent way to pump all our vampires and grant them evasion. Captivating Vampire serves as a decent lord that can work nicely with Timothar to steal and recur our opponent's creatures by turning them into vampires then into bats as they die. Callistra Highborn is a great source of drain as it and our other vampires die to pile on the damage, and Sorin Imperious Bloodlord makes for a very solid walker that helps enable both our vampires and our aristocrat playstyle by both powering up and cheating vampires into play while also allowing us to sack them for even more drain. Finally, if we want to make our tutors even more efficient at the cost of copious amounts of cash, Diabolic Intent is great for being a cheap tutor and sack effect, Demonic Tutor is a superb cheap tutor with no strings attached or hoops to jump through, and Vampiric Tutor is the cheapest tutor around, at least mana-wise, to ensure we get the cards we need as quickly as possible. And remember, if you want a second copy of it, Imperial Seal is a functional reprint at only $800 and serves as a way to simulate how it feels to be bled dry, which is appropriate for this deck at least. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Another thanks is in order for this channel subs, as you've all been able to bring this channel to its 2.5k milestone. Thanks again for all of your support, as this channel would not have been able to get to this point without it. Moving on to the results of last week's poll, it looks like the competition croaked against Gralnock the Omnivore, so look forward to a frog-themed self-mill deck featuring them next week. Moving on to this week's poll, let's have some human contenders step up to the polls this time around and see if they can compete with their more monstrous colleagues. That means this week's poll will be featuring a Ruth Tormented Prophet, Torrens Fist of the Angels, and Jacob Harkin Inspector. Please cast your vote in the community tab, link in the description, and let me know in the comments who you voted for and what commanders from Crimson Vow you'd like to see in a future poll. Before we close out, again, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel cannot grow without your support. And if you feel like showing your thanks by keeping me caffeinated while I work on these videos, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank Jason M for their generous donation. Thanks for the coffee, Jason, and thanks for supporting the channel. And if any of you would like to support the channel in a different way, feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you'd like to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.